Welcome to Trench Diaries. Juno Beach. Part 2.
He reported that a large formation of ships was sighted off the coast and was advancing on our beach. He had no specific details about numbers or strength, but this appeared to be a very large attacking force. I ordered him to go up and return with any more information that was available, if any. In the meantime, the shelling paused, which felt really strange after all the noise. The men who had lost control pulled themselves together and apologized for their behavior. This was the least of my worries, but it was a sign that they might pull through psychologically. I ordered one of the Goliaths to be brought to the exit door, that is, the door onto the beach which was shielded with rocks. We started the Goliath's engine to warm it again, and the rattle of the little device was almost comical after the great bombardment. The unintended amusement was a way of breaking the tension and the stress. Our grins were wiped away though when we heard aircraft coming over the beach very low and the sound of cannon fire. Through the vision slit I could see the aircraft overhead. They appeared to be hurricane types. They were strafing the beach, dunes and buildings. We heard many of the cannon shells hit our bunker, but they did not penetrate the concrete. I heard a single flak gun respond to them, but this one fell silent very quickly. These fighter bombers came back repeatedly, and it would have been suicide to step out of cover at that point. I saw that their cannon shells were tearing the beach up and breaking pieces off the surrounding rocks. When these planes left, there was a second or two of calm, literally no more than that. I used the bunker periscope to try to observe the sea. I could make out various flashes offshore, the lines of light which were evidently rockets. These rockets were flying over our bunker and exploding behind us, or in some cases smacking onto the beach and blowing up there. They burst with a bright orange light and spread a lot of shrapnel at very high speed. I saw one rocket bounce off the sand without exploding and sail off up into the rocks, turning end over end like a stick. Finally, when the beach was absolutely covered in debris and the smoke began to clear, I saw tanks approaching from the sea. I was very surprised at this, because I knew that the Wehrmacht could adapt tanks to cross rivers and lakes underwater, but these tanks seemed to be entirely amphibious. They were Sherman-class tanks, this was clear from the rounded turret. They were fitted with what seemed to me to be canvas boxes or screens around their hulls, and they were literally swimming towards the shore. I was astonished to see this. They were not on rafts or being towed, but somehow swimming under their own propulsion. As an engineer, I simply could not understand how the Allies got these tanks to do that. But of course, this was also the exact situation that my Goliath machines were intended to counter. I could see 3 of these tanks, although my view was limited. Our pack guns started firing on them from the resistance points. I ordered my men to move the first Goliath to the beach outside the exit door. The Goliath was controlled by a man with a unit built onto a plywood holder, and I gave him directions as I looked through the periscope. I ordered him to drive the Goliath out onto the beach, and I looked down from the periscope to see the machine rattling off through the door. It unwound its control cables behind it from a drum, which allowed us to steer and detonate it remotely. It disappeared from the doorway, and through the periscope I could see it advancing across the beach towards the edge of the sea. This was exactly the plan, that we would detonate the machines as tanks came onto the beach and engage the pack guns or were held up by the packs. I could see splashes in the water as our pack gunners in the resistance point shot at the Shermans. I saw one pack round deflect off the nearest tank's turret and actually fly up into the air for a great distance. Then another round hit the same tank and pierced the armor of the turret by the main gun mantle. The tank continued to advance, but it was trailing smoke and it fell behind the other 2 tanks, which were now coming up out of the shallows onto the beach itself. Several more large shells began falling on us at the seafront line, not from the tanks but from offshore. I could see the outlines of many ships behind these Shermans, a huge number of ships, and some of them were firing large caliber guns. One of these shells struck the rocks in front of us and shook our whole bunker through the core. The blast wave knocked me over and I lost sight of the Goliath through the periscope. When I looked again, I saw that the Goliath was stationary on the beach and appeared to be damaged, with one of its tracks missing. Then the operator told me that the machine was not responding. He tried repeatedly to make the device move with the controls, but the shell blast must have severed the control cables. This meant we could not steer or detonate the device, and all this time the Sherman tanks were advancing on the beach. The Sherman that had been hit by a pack was now capsizing and burning. Crewmen were climbing off of it, several of them were on fire as they jumped into the water. Our machine gunners were firing, but I could see their bullets bouncing off the front plates of the Shermans, making bright sparks. I ordered another Goliath to be sent out, and this one disappeared out of the doorway in the same manner as the previous one. The men watched it go with very tense faces. They could not see the beach outside, but through the periscope I could follow the progress of the new Goliath towards the Shermans. I gave directions to the operator. Straight ahead. Turn right. Now straight again. And in this rudimentary way, we steered the device towards the tanks among the flying debris. I was hopeful that we would knock out at least one of these attacking tanks, but as the Goliath approached them, it tipped into a shell crater and did not emerge. The operator tried to move it forwards and back, but I think it had fallen on its side and was immobilized. It was about 20 meters from the nearest Sherman, which was firing on the resistance point and the dunes and machine gunning along the beach. I gave the order to detonate the Goliath, as there was nothing else to be gained from it. It made a substantial explosion, and all its machinery went whirling out across the beach for hundreds of meters. The blast made the Sherman rock from side to side, but the tank kept firing and moving. At this point I began to doubt the Goliath system. I began to see that we would need to be quite fortunate to make it effective against tanks, because it would need to be completely adjacent to them to blow them up. It might be more suitable against landing barges, and in fact I could see several barges approaching on the water. I told the men to start up another Goliath and to bring more down from the covered tunnel in readiness. The men were actioning this when the situation changed and we found ourselves under infantry attack. Because the periscope only gave a forward view of the beach, I did not see where these infantrymen had come from. I think they must have landed from the sea some distance to my left and were now moving along the beach towards the resistance point and the houses. There were about 20 of these troops in British-type uniforms armed with rifles and Thompson guns. I found out later that all these men were in fact Canadian. They passed about 10 meters in front of our bunker without seeing us because we were so well concealed among the rocks. One of my men, without my order, fired through the vision slit and he shot down one of these Canadian troops. This was a big mistake because it revealed our location. The shot soldier was writhing in the sand and he was producing a lot of blood. The others took cover and pointed at our position. I took in these details in a strangely detached way, although my mind was racing, thinking what we should do next. One of the Canadians who came into view had a flamethrower unit, which was a tube attached to a tank on his back. It was very obvious to see. We had no time to react to this. I began to give the command to fire again through the vision slit and the doorway to hit the man with the flamethrower, but this flamethrower operator turned straight onto us and fired his unit. The experience of being under flamethrower attack was terrifying, I must say. The unit produced a long sheet of flame which shot directly towards us in the bunker. The light of the flame was blinding, and the speed of its action was astonishing. In a second, the flame hit the doorway onto the beach and the fire entered the bunker. The flame was based on some kind of gasoline mixture, and this liquid splashed wildly as it poured in, and it burned fiercely. It caught 2 of our men immediately and set them on fire. Their uniforms went up in thick flames and smoke, and they threw themselves about, crashing into the other men and flailing their arms. They screamed as they thrashed about, and I can still hear these screams in my mind. The flamethrower fired again, and the flames raced in directly through the door, soaking the nearest wall in the burning liquid. Many of the flames splashed onto the waiting Goliath and set it on fire. All the men who could still move leaped for the exit door through the exit tunnel, and I was in no state of mind to resist their retreat. The flames were pouring down the wall, and the whole bunker was full of smoke and the stench of gasoline. The 2 men who had been hit were enveloped in flames, still moving but no longer screaming. I jumped for the doorway to the tunnel, and behind me there was the noise again of the dreadful flamethrower shooting its flames in from the beach. I ran into the tunnel where our stored Goliath machines were lined up, and I followed the men as they ran like rabbits up the tunnel to the bunker area at the top. The light, noise, and the smell of the flames was behind us all the way. I think the Canadians burned that bunker out completely. The Goliath down there did not explode though, or at least I did not hear it explode. Everything was now confused and dislocated. My next memory is of arriving at the top of the covered tunnel and stumbling out into the light, not really knowing what was happening. I had my pistol in my hand and I ran straight into a Canadian soldier who had a rifle with a bayonet fixed. We literally bumped into each other. The shock of this stunned me. because I thought I would be in a strong position up at the resistance point, but the Canadian gave a shout and swung at me with the stock of his rifle and smashed me in the face across my eyes. I fell back onto the ground, blinded. This was the first time I ever had been in hand-to-hand combat, and I was not prepared for it, neither mentally or physically. This man was determined to kill me, that was clear. It may sound strange, but the realization that he wanted to kill me suddenly filled my mind with the knowledge that I therefore had to kill him first. This all lasted barely moments, just fractions of a second. I could barely see him, but I knew he was raising his rifle over me, either to shoot or to stab me with the bayonet. I fired up at this figure with my pistol, not aiming properly, but just pointing it at its outline. I fired twice, and sprays of blood from him blew back at me. Then his shape disappeared, and I could see the open sky, which was completely crisscrossed with aircraft trails. I became aware that fighting was taking place all around me, with men fighting at close quarters around the entrance to the main pack point. The Canadian that I had just shot was lying beside me, apparently dead. I could not understand where these Canadians had sprung from. They must have traversed the seawall at a point along the beach and charged up to the pack there. They were attacking us like men possessed by devils, I can tell you that. They had blown open the door of the main pack bunker, and they were firing inside and throwing grenades in there. Others were shooting down our troops who were appearing from trenches on the other side, and there was frantic shooting between the two groups. Everything was very confused. In this chaos, I rolled over and threw myself into one of the slit trenches that ran back from the bunker. I landed on top of two bodies, a German soldier and a Canadian soldier, who had shot and stabbed each other with their rifles. They were both very young, and their dead faces looked quite similar. I saw this as I crawled over them along the trench. I wasn't pursued by the Canadians at this point, because the situation was very uncertain on all sides. There was a lot of shooting and tracer going over the top of the trench, and shrapnel flying across as well. I didn't know where I was going, but I still only had my pistol and my vision was blurred with blood from where that soldier hit me in the face. I rounded one of the corners of this trench and came into contact with 3 German soldiers who were also retreating away from the resistance point. They were well armed, with MP40 machine pistols and grenades. Together, we hunched down and scrambled along this trench to its furthest point, where it met a path that led away from the beach sector and went inland towards our next line of defenses. These men told me that there was a force already assembling at the next resistance point. I told them that we should get up out of the trench and join this force and fight from there. Being an officer, I went up over the top of the trench first and scrambled down the path to a point where it was not visible from the seafront area. The man who followed me was hit by a mortar burst and his arm and face were torn off. He died in a few seconds. I confess that I took his MP40 immediately and shouted to the others to follow. That was the nature of this combat. We had to keep moving quickly, regardless of losses. The other 2 men jumped over the trench and came with me, and together we crouched and ran off along the path towards the next resistance point. I knew this point well. It was a Tobruk-style installation with an old French tank turret mounted on a concrete ring and several machine gun points. The approach was mined, and in our haste one of the 2 troops with me went off the path and onto the minefield. There was a small explosion and he fell forward, making horrible sounds. I saw that his legs were blown off below the knee and his trousers were burning, showing his shin bones in the smoke. His whole body was convulsing in response to the injury, and as he thrashed about, he set off another mine under his body. This blew a large piece out of his chest, and he went still. I did not even have time to react to this dreadful sight. With the remaining soldier, I reached the resistance point in a few minutes. We were almost killed by a Tobruk machine gunner who fired on us, injuring the man with me very badly. I managed to carry this man the last few meters to the point and left him in a trench at the rear face. At this time it was about 8 AM, so this was about 90 minutes after the initial landings. The resistance point had a phone cable and a Feldwebel there was relaying information to a command point deeper in the defensive belt. I added my information, that the Goliath and pack bunkers were destroyed and the Allies were bringing tanks directly onto the beach. During this whole time, mortar and rocket rounds were landing in our vicinity. We could also hear the sound of tanks from the dunes and many explosions along the beachside. All this suggested that the attackers were to some extent in charge of the beach and they had tanks preparing to move out towards us. There were about 30 men at this resistance point, including a local infantry officer, a man whom I knew well. We agreed that this point could be held if we made great efforts and rallied the men. We tried to motivate them by reminding them of the need to push the Allies back into the sea and the danger to us all if they gained a foothold on the coast. The men responded very positive. A small minority, who were mostly older German troops or Eastern troops, were quiet, and I suspected their hearts were not in the fight. On the other hand, some of the men aged 40 plus and some of the Eastern men were also very positive, so it was not a simple distinction of all the older Eastern men had no appetite for combat. These Eastern troops had their own leaders and insignia. They were Polish, Ukrainian or Baltic men who had been enlisted or had volunteered for the Wehrmacht and wore the same uniforms as the German troops, serving under the same officers. We must remember that at this stage in the war the German armed forces were a kaleidoscope of European nationalities and languages. This to some extent bolstered the idea of the so-called United Europe. I expected to see the Shermans within minutes. The clear path to the beach zone between the minefield was just wide enough for a tank to pass. This was deliberate, in order to force tanks into this passage so that they could be destroyed and the access would then be blocked. The distance from the beach sector to this point was about 400 meters. As for the resistance point, the old French tank turret at the center was very solid Char B type, with thick armor mounting a medium caliber anti-tank gun. It was crewed by men in an underground chamber who had extensive supplies of ammunition. There were 2 MG42 machine guns in emplacements at each corner, connected by a series of trenches, and all these guns had an arc down the path and a slight incline towards the beach zone. All but one of the approaches were mined, and there were entanglements of barbed wire around the perimeter. So this was not a bad position to hold, at least in the short term. I took up a position in one of the trenches beside the tank turret, armed with my MP40. I took over an informal command of the 15 men, approximately, in this trench, and I urged them to be watchful. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you know how the algorithm works. Like, comment, subscribe, it means a lot to me. See you in the next video.